Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, great. Good morning from San Francisco, and thank you very much for inviting me to take part in this exciting symposium. I've learned so much from all of the previous speakers, and I hope that someday I will be able to meet you in person. As we all know, this pandemic is unprecedented, and the global biomedical response to it is equally unprecedented. At Gilead Sciences, we've had the privilege to take part in this response, and it's been really an incredible journey. And today I'm excited to share with you our experience with the development of Remdesivir. And this work really represents the efforts of hundreds of people around the world working around the clock. And we have a long way to go still, but hope that Remdesivir can play a role in this pandemic. So let me see if I can share my screen and get started. Is the screen visible to everybody? Hopefully.
Yeah, it's visible.
Okay, great. Thank you. So we'll start with some brief background on the molecule remdesivir and then just briefly touch on the preclinical data supporting its use in the clinic and spend most of the time talking about the clinical trial data that have been generated so far. And some of the previous speakers have given some great background on this. And I'm excited to know that the WHO is now starting trials that will include sites in India. So remdesivir is a nucleotide analog with in vitro activity against several RNA virus families, including, of course, importantly, coronaviridae. It's an IV medication that's given daily, and we are currently working on development of an inhaled dosage form to hopefully allow the treatment of people earlier in the course of disease and possibly as outpatients. Unfortunately, remdesivir is not suitable for oral administration because of almost complete first pass metabolism. This slide shows the preclinical data in a rhesus macaque model of SARS-CoV-2. The animals were treated with remdesivir or vehicle 12 hours post-inoculation with virus. And the clinical score results suggested that the remdesivir treated animals derived benefit from the drug. And this was also verified on lung pathology. Here we have an overview of the selected remdesivir trials, and we'll be focusing on the first three today. You can see the different patient populations in which this drug has been studied so far. And the two Gilead-sponsored trials that I led were asking the question, is a 5-day treatment course as effective and safe as a 10-day course? And the NIH-led trial was a double-blind, placebo-controlled randomized trial asking about the efficacy of remdesivir compared to placebo. And as I mentioned, there are now trials being run by the WHO all over the world. And if we have time, I'll just touch on the next steps for the remdesivir development program, which include combinations with anti-inflammatory drugs. Two trials that we won't be getting into detail about today were conducted in China when the epidemic first erupted. And the one trial was done in severe patients. It was a placebo-controlled trial, but because the outbreak was controlled by the time the trial started, the enrollment was not complete, and therefore the trial was underpowered to ask its primary efficacy question. And the moderate trial also was eventually suspended due to low enrollment. The timeline of the remdesivir studies has been extremely fast-paced, and we received the first request for compassionate use of the drug on February 25th, and just a few weeks later launched several large global trials. In the US, emergency use authorization was given on May 2nd, and the drug was approved in Japan on May 8th. At the same time, we had a number of collaborative studies that were started all over the world. And again, this reflects the efforts of many people across multiple institutions. So the China trials that I mentioned, NIH, WHO, and an upcoming study with Roche. So let's take a closer look at the NIH results. This is the NIAID ACTT Adaptive Treatment Trial, and it has been published in the New England Journal of Medicine. This study was a phase 3 randomized double-blind placebo-controlled multi-center global trial in adults with confirmed COVID-19. And importantly, patients who required mechanical ventilation were included in this trial. 1,000 patients were enrolled and randomized to receive either 10 days of remdesivir or placebo, with the primary outcome being the time to recovery. And the enrollment occurred from February through April. And on April 27th, a data safety monitoring board reviewed the preliminary results and suggested that the results should be provided unblinded to trial team members. And that led to the publication of the data in the New England Journal. So what were those results that caused the preliminary unblinding of the trial? When you look at the primary outcome, which was time to recovery, in the remdesivir group, the patients who were treated recovered by a median of 11 days compared to 15 days in the placebo group, and this reached statistical significance. There was also a trend for a mortality benefit by day 14, but the study was not powered to ask the question of mortality. A key secondary outcome, the odds of clinical improvement, was also higher in the remdesivir group compared to the placebo group. So this study was conducted in patients with severe COVID, and 90% of them actually did have severe disease. And again, the primary outcome was median time to recovery, which met the efficacy endpoint, as well as the secondary endpoint of recovery by day 15. And there was a trend towards a mortality benefit as well. Now, interestingly, the primary benefit was most apparent in the patients who had a baseline clinical score of 5, which corresponds to requiring supplemental oxygen, but not high flow oxygen or mechanical ventilation. And that's probably partly due to the larger sample size in that subgroup. However, we do think there is a need to identify and treat COVID-19 cases before progression to mechanical ventilation. And some of the combination studies that are now being launched are aimed at addressing that issue. We don't have time to go into all of the safety data, but in this placebo-controlled trial, serious adverse events were reported in 21% of the patients in the remdesivir arm and 27% in the placebo arm. So slightly higher in the placebo arm, and non-serious adverse events were not significantly different. This study is still ongoing, and the final results through day 28 will be reported in the next few months. So next, we'll look at the data from the remdesivir trials run through Gilead. These were named the simple trials because they were aimed at answering the question of whether 5 or 10 days of remdesivir would be appropriate for treating COVID-19. And the results from the severe trial were published in the New England Journal of Medicine recently as well. This is the study design for the phase 3 open label study of 5 versus 10 days of remdesivir in patients with severe COVID infection. And part A of the study is the set of data and the set of patients from whom the primary efficacy endpoints will be assessed. And part B, we enrolled up to an additional 5,600 patients to collect additional safety data. And importantly, in part A, patients who were mechanically ventilated were not enrolled, but they were enrolled in part B. The primary endpoint was clinical status as assessed by a 7-point ordinal scale on day 14, and safety was the secondary endpoint. Here are the primary efficacy results. So after adjusting for baseline disease severity, the odds of having a better outcome on day 14 for the 10-day group compared to the 5-day group was 0.75, demonstrating that the efficacy of the 5 and 10-day courses were not statistically significant. And by other metrics as well, the 5 and 10-day groups were similar, although the 5-day group had numerically better outcomes. But this was largely driven by the imbalance in the baseline disease status. So at baseline, more male patients happened to be enrolled in the 10-day group, and more patients who fell into the more severe disease categories also were randomized to the 10-day group purely by chance. But once you adjusted for those baseline differences, 5 and 10 days of remdesivir looked very similar. We did want to ask the question of whether there were any patients who may actually benefit from the longer treatment. So to answer that question, we looked at the outcomes by the clinical status on day 5 of the therapy. And if you focus on the patients who were mechanically ventilated on day 5 and focus on the mortality rates, you can see that the 10-day group actually had a lower mortality rate compared to the 5-day group. Now, the numbers in this sub-analysis are quite small, again, because we also didn't enroll mechanically ventilated patients from the beginning. But it does suggest that if a patient has progressed to mechanical ventilation within those first 5 days of remdesivir treatment, it makes sense to continue their treatment for another 5 days. In contrast, really the other groups as separated by baseline disease status didn't really show a difference between 5 and 10 days. So to summarize this severe study in the severe simple study, again, 5 and 10 days were not different from each other in patients who did not require mechanical ventilation at baseline. Some of the numerical differences between the 5 and 10-day group were really driven by baseline imbalances in disease status. And for the safety evaluations in this study that we didn't cover, there were transient liver enzyme elevations in both groups. We also know that COVID-19 has been associated with liver injury. And again, the NIH placebo-controlled trial helps to elucidate that observation. And finally, the last study that we'll look at is the study of remdesivir in patients with moderate COVID-19. So these were individuals who were hospitalized, but had an oxygen saturation of greater than 94% on room air. And they were randomized in equal proportions to receive either 10 days of remdesivir, 5 days, or standard of care. So unlike the severe study, this moderate study actually included a standard of care arm. This was an open label trial, and the primary endpoint was clinical status as assessed by a 7-point scale on day 11. We also have a part B to this study where we have also enrolled hundreds of more patients to try to collect more data. The preliminary results of this study were disclosed in a press release in the first week of June. So when we look at the primary endpoint and we compare 5 days of remdesivir to standard of care, the odds ratio was 1.65, favoring the 5-day treatment of remdesivir compared to standard of care. The 10-day treatment compared to standard of care also had a trend towards favoring the remdesivir arm, but didn't reach statistical significance. So to summarize these study results for the moderate remdesivir study, the 5-day course in treatment of patients with moderate COVID-19 led to significant improvements in clinical status at day 11 compared to standard of care. And higher proportion of patients in the 5-day group also achieved an improvement in clinical status and recovery compared to standard of care. And the reason that these two studies looking at the optimal duration of treatment are important is that given the limited drug supply of remdesivir, if we can shorten the course to 5 days compared to 10 days, we may have the potential to double the global drug supply. And I'll just finish with a couple of studies that are now being launched. And again, these studies are taking the next step of asking, okay, remdesivir seems to show some efficacy and clinical improvement, but the mortality rate is still high. And we now understand more clearly that there's a dysregulated immune response that may contribute to the mortality in severe stages of COVID-19. And so the next step in the NIH study is to compare remdesivir and baricitinib versus remdesivir alone. And baricitinib is a JAK inhibitor that's marketed by Lilly for the treatment of rheumatoid arthritis. And interestingly, it may have dual mechanisms for providing benefit in COVID-19. One is the inhibition of cytokine signaling, and it also is a NAC inhibitor as well, which may help to prevent propagation of viral infection in epithelial cells. So this study has already enrolled several hundred patients, and we look forward to those results. Some of the previous speakers had also referred to the role of IL-6 in the hyperinflammatory response to COVID-19. And so in collaboration with Roche, a phase 3 study of Acceptra, which is tocilizumab plus remdesivir, is being tested in patients with severe COVID-19, and that should start soon as well. So in addition to these clinical trials that we discussed today, Gilead is also attempting to play a role in the public health response by donating 1.5 million doses or more than 140,000 treatment courses of remdesivir, and also working with various organizations to improve access to the drug. And I'm sure that you have seen recently in the news that Gilead has entered into long-term licensing agreements with several generic drug companies in South Asia. And we're also in discussions with UNICEF to understand how we can distribute the drug globally. So with that, I just wanted to thank all of you for the opportunity to share some of these data that are still ongoing in terms of data generation with all of you today, and thank the thousands of patients who have contributed to this effort by enrolling in these trials, their families, and all of the scientific and medical teams across the world who are trying to make advances against this pandemic. Thank you very much, and I hope to connect with you again in the future.